Welcome to today's episode. Today we chat with my friend Jack. Jack is the founder of Gem Energy. He started this company by himself with nothing but $2,500 in his account, and he turned that into 1.1 revenue in his first year. We also discuss the pros and cons of hiring your friends in business. We talk about how to scale a business, when to bring in the right employees, how to choose the right employees, how to create a great winning culture. We also talk about selling your business, selling portions of your business, how to choose the right investors, pros and cons and different ways in which you can sell your business. And we tackle many other topics. Today is one of my favorite episodes that I have recorded. There's plenty of golden nuggets in here. It's definitely an episode that you can rewatch and extract some information and perhaps apply to your own businesses. So sit back and enjoy. All right, Mr. Jack Hooper, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, mate.
So before we jump into it and hear about your story, maybe give us a bit of a brief on, I guess, what Gem Energy is, your company, and what it does and what you guys are all about.
Yeah, sure. So we do largely residential and commercial solar PV and battery installations. Started just doing residential solar installations back in 2013. And then we sort of pivoted more towards commercial in about 2015, 2016. Kept doing residential, but a lot of the focus went into growing that commercial side of the business. And then we started adding battery storage, LED lighting, heat pumps, other energy efficiency things. And then more recently, we're sort of helping organizations and large corporations transition to net zero on their scope 2 emissions. So, you know, there's been a big shift in the energy space recently with renewables coming into the grid, but more than anything, it's actually stakeholders, shareholders, and investors driving organizations to commit to an energy emissions reduction. So, you know, we're finding that a lot of corporations are coming to us and saying, look, we've been told by our parent company or shareholders or investors that we need to reduce emissions by 50%. Where do we start? And we're sort of in a unique position where we can actually help with the strategy, write the strategy, say this is how you should do it, this is when you should do it, and these are the technologies that you should use. So we do the sort of the consultancy, the engineering, the procurement, and the construction. So it's a full end-to-end. So we're sort of really big in the commercial space now. It makes about 70% of the business and 30% is residential.
Yeah, right. Cool. So there's about 50 billion things we'll dive into on that one, but we'll get to that as we sort of go through. I want to go back to your beginnings. So you moved here from English lad. Won't hold that against you. But yeah, you moved here from England quite a while ago. When you first moved to Oz, when you first came to Oz, moved to Oz, was that on a holiday or a working visa, or was it initially like you knew you were going to stay here for a while?
No, it was a working holiday visa. I had no intention of staying in Australia. I was actually what I thought was going back to California. So I did a very, very sort of low income parents. My mum was disabled, my dad was disabled, so we sort of lived off the government benefits in the UK. And I wanted to change of pace. I went to university in Birmingham at Aston, and didn't do too well at uni. I'm not an academic. I just never could grasp that side of things, sitting down and writing essays. So I didn't do too well, but during university I went and did multiple things. Like I went to Madrid for a year to do international business, and then after Madrid I moved to California for 4 months, and I was working at a summer camp, one of the YMCA summer camps. Loved it. I loved California. I had a great time, and went back to uni, graduated uni, and then me and a few of the other lads decided that we'd go traveling through Southeast Asia, then into Australia. Then the plan was to New Zealand, America, and then potentially back to the UK. And I had no idea what I wanted to do. It was a feeder university. So if you've got a good grade, you typically go into one of big 4 consultancy firms or IT firms. But I didn't get a good enough grade. So I just said, well, I'll just go traveling. And I got to Australia after about 3 months, and I went and worked on the banana farms up in northern Queensland. And I did my mandatory 3-month visa. That was really fun. Life was simple back then. And then there was this, a friend of mine was telling me that he survived in Australia off of drug trials. So he would go to the hospitals. And and this red hot opportunity came up, and it was $7,000 cash for 28 days to be in a hospital. And I was just like, shit, yeah, why not? So I did that, and I met one of my close friends, Stewie, on that trial. And he was just like, he was so good. He was like, mate, come and hang out with me on the coast for a bit. So I did the drug trial, went back, finished up on the banana farms, and then went and hung out with Stewie on the Gold Coast. And we sort of, I ran out of money, essentially, because, backpacking.
That's what you do, yeah.
And we applied for these, me and Stewie both applied for this job on Gumtree. And it was a door knocking job. So you go out and knock on people's doors, generate the lead, and then a salesperson would come in and close it. And I went for the interview, and it was like commission only. It was like $50 a lead. And I was like, it was like March or something. And I was like, I did not have much appetite to venture out into regional Queensland in that heat for $50 commission only. So I sort of said, nah, this is not for me. And they said, have you got any experience in sales? And I said, no. And they said, can you read off a script? And I said, yes. So then I got a gig in telesales, or telemarketing, actually. So I was just hustling 250 calls a day on an automatic dialer. And then I got into sales, and I think I found my calling then, because I had no idea what I wanted to do with life. I was like 24 or something like that. And I loved sales. I loved it, and I still do. And it's a lot of people hate sales and think it just has one of those stigmas.
Yeah, it does.
I love it, and I was good. Like, I was really good, and because I was good, I was passionate about it. And when you're passionate about something and you've got capability, you flourish, and I did. But I burnt out, and I burnt out really quickly. But I was 2011. I was just come out of backpacking. I was putting like 5-10K a week in commissions.
What were you selling?
Solar.
Oh, you were, yeah.
Yeah, that's how I got into the solar industry. And, like back then, you was making 5-10 grand a week sometimes, and it was just paid weekly, and you're just like, what do I do with this? So, you can imagine what you do with it.
Yeah, 24 as well.
Yeah, it was a good time. But, that's not sustainable. You burn out, and I did burn out. And then all of the premium solar feed-in tariffs, because back then, you could get 44 cents per kilowatt hour for putting solar into the grid, and that was driving a lot of demand. And when they cancelled those incentives, the industry just died. Like, it just tanked. And I was like, okay, I'll go and try to get some other jobs. And I must have applied for anywhere from 50 to 100 jobs in Brisbane, and I did not get a single interview. And I had a degree from a good university, not even a single interview, and that's because of my visa. So I really had no other choice but to really start a business, but that takes money. There's a lot of things. So I ended up doing a mechanics apprenticeship thing, because that was, I could go onto study visa. So I did a mechanics apprenticeship, and I was working off of my own ABN, selling solar in the evenings. And I did all of that, and I had $2.5 grand saved, and then I decided to go and start my own company. So 1st of July 2013, I registered the business, and off I went. So it's just, I really only had $2.5 grand, and it was interesting how we got going, but that's sort of where it started.
Yeah. When you were selling the telemarketing, I don't know the timelines, was that when there was that huge incentives from the government, and they were giving massive rebates to put solar on your homes?
That's that 44 cent that I was talking about. This is the thing, if you put in let's say a 5 kilowatt system back then, you could generate like $1,000 a quarter in income.
You'd be getting money back.
Yeah, so you're getting $1,000 a quarter residual, just income into your account until 2028. But back then, the cost of systems was like 25 grand, 30 grand. And I remember we were given this script, and the company that I was working for paid Jordan Belfort to write the sales script for them. And I think they paid about 250 grand to set up the script, to set the culture, like what people should wear, how people should act, the office layouts, all of that stuff. And God, that script was deadly.
Good.
It was, I couldn't believe how effective it was. And I would pick up, I was on a dialer, so it'd just be, I'd just see Mr. Smith and a suburb, and it'd be like, oh, Mr. Smith, it's Jack calling, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes I'd get off the phone in less than 10 minutes, having processed a $5,000 or $10,000 deposit, because people were like, this is too good to be true. And it was really. And anybody that did get onto that scheme, even though they paid 25 grand for what they'd pay really 6 or 7 for now, they're still like, they're laughing.
Yeah. Well, it's $4 grand a year, and then at 10 years, it's 40K.
It's quick math.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because it's also interesting because back then, telemarketing was obviously a thing, but people were more receptive to answering the phone. And
it wasn't as
people
saturated.
never answer the phone now, and it's saturated. And like everyone's like, "Fuck off, hang up."
And it is difficult now, but it's not to say that sort of outbound cold call telemarketing business doesn't work.
It still does, yeah.
Mate, some guys I know, they just sold their business for 47 million, and all they do is cold call outbound. And it's still viable.
Yeah. So you kind of didn't really have much choice. You had to work for yourself. So you started off still doing the same thing. So you did a mechanical apprenticeship during the day, and then sales calls at night. Mm-hmm. Same thing, like you selling
solar, but that wasn't selling solar for my own business. I was still, working for other companies. I needed to finish the mechanics sort of apprenticeship thing, and then I was thinking, what do I do? Do I go to be a mechanic? And I was like, I didn't want to be a mechanic. I do love cars, and I love everything about cars, but I didn't really fancy being a mechanic. So I did it, and then I just said, well, I couldn't get a job in the city, so why don't we just give this a crack? And I was based on the Gold Coast at the time, and I'd been traveling to regional Queensland quite a lot to do remote sales. And, the people in central Queensland are so warm and welcoming and trustworthy. And I was really successful in those areas. So I sort of decided, well, do you know what? I might move to Emerald in central Queensland and get a job in the mines, just driving a water truck for 100 grand a year or whatever it was, or cleaning. It was 100 grand a year. Back then I was like,
that's 150 now.
Yeah. And so we moved out to Emerald in central Queensland, and that's where the business started. And I was like, I don't really want a job in the mines. So let's put everything into this solar thing. But I only had 2.5 grand, so I didn't have a lot of capital behind me, but I got it started with 2.5 grand, and I didn't do any telemarketing. I had a $40 printer at home. I made up my own flyers. I'd print them, and the printer was crap, and you'd see the lines. We've all seen them. But I was walking around knocking on people's doors, and a lot of people were in the mines, so they were typically working at night and at home during the day, or split shifts or whatever it might be. So there's quite a high success rate of knocking and people answering. And back then, solar was only probably 10% penetration on rooftops, so not many homes had it. And I would just knock on the door, and they were always like, "Oh, how can I help you, mate?" And I'd get into the pitch and talk about it. And I just structured the value proposition so well that they couldn't say no. So, and you'd out there, people were so welcoming. You'd pitch them, and they'd sign up on the spot, and they'd be like, "Oh, you should go and talk to my mate." And it would just go bang, bang, bang. And you would, sometimes I'd meet someone's house, and I've pitched it so well that he felt like we were friends, and he'd call his mate to come over, and his mate would come over, and they'd open up a 6-pack, and then I'd sell them on the spot as well. It was crazy. And I did that. I was effective doing that because I realized that back then everybody wanted solar. It was booming, but everybody felt like, oh, we've just missed out on the 44-cent tariff. So there was that buyer's remorse, and it's always difficult to overcome that. But you just had to structure the value prop in such a way that it still made good economic sense. So, a 6 kilowatt system back then. I think we were retailing it for like 12 and a half or 15 grand. But I partnered with a green energy finance company. So a company that had, they would loan essentially, over 7 years. So, and the interest rates were low back then. So I could structure it in such a way where the solar system would save the customer, let's say $50 per week on their power bill, but their repayment to the bank was only $44 a week. So it was a cash flow positive investment. So there's no upfront cost. So I overcame that hurdle immediately. And then they're like, okay, well, if there's no upfront cost and the system is saving me more than I'm paying for it, why wouldn't I do it?
It's almost a no-brainer.
It is, yeah. And then obviously, you're still selling a $15,000 product. So as long as you could give the customer enough comfort around yourself, the products, the technology, everything, then they would go ahead with it. And my sales pitch was so refined coming from such a high pressure sales environment before that my sort of conversion rate on my leads was really high. And in that first year, I started with a $2,500 credit card and I turned over 1.1 million.
I was going to ask what the margins were on that.
Oh, the margins back then, mate, not like they are now. They were good. And the margins were good because I had no overhead, nothing. I didn't even have an office, nothing.
Yeah.
So, but what I didn't want to do is, if I'm coming in and competing against all of these established businesses, I didn't want to come in and significantly undercut them because I'd be driving down the market. So I just positioned myself very marginally below what the sort of competitor pricing was. Yeah. But these are businesses that might have had 20-25% OPEX. And I had no OPEX. So, they're charging 35% gross. We've got 25% OPEX. They're making 10%. I was just making 35%.
Yeah, so you can take 5% off and still make 30.
Yes, exactly. So, and that meant that we were competitive. And if you're too cheap, any product that you have, if you're too cheap, you devalue it. So that's
sus as well.
Yeah. But I didn't even have any money to go and buy the solar equipment to do the first job. I had $2,500. So I remember driving into a wholesaler's yard and I was so nervous and I ran over some equipment. I was really nervous.
What is this Muppet doing here?
Yeah. And the equipment was only really low value. It was like a couple $100 worth of stuff, but it was all aluminium rails. So the clatter, the noise that it made and the whole business came out. I was like, fuck, this is not a good start. But I went in and said, look, I've got all of these contracts. I've got no money. I'm willing to pay a premium on your normal buy pricing if you'll front me an account, essentially. So they gave me a $20,000 unsecured account, and I got that $20,000 worth of equipment. I installed it. Because I'm not an electrician or anything, I found a subcontractor to go and do the jobs for me. And I said to the subby, I'll pay you 10% above your standard rates if you can supply all the electrical materials and the racking. And then I'll pay you when I get paid by the client. So I made it so that I didn't have any cash outflows until I got the cash inflows.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to use my own capital. So that's how I structured it, and that's how I got started. And after sort of 3 to 6 months, I was still the only employee for the first year. I just had profit coming in, but like most businesses, you don't really, when you're accounting on a cash basis, you can't really understand how much profit you're actually making. And I sort of operated that way for 3 or 4 years. And it wasn't until year 4, year 5, where I was like, oh, actually I could be making some pretty decent money here. But yeah.
Did anybody teach you like any of that in terms of like, cause you're like, oh, I'll ask for the credit basically. Like you went and found your own creditors and then you
nothing, mate. All of it was, like I went to university and I studied business.
Business, yeah. Okay.
I had a 7% attendance rate, and I would not have passed if it wasn't for my mates letting me copy their assignments. Right. So I was very lucky, but there must have been a bit of knowledge that had sort of sunk in the back end, but learn on the job, really. Yeah.
In the beginning, obviously you're out there door knocking, grinding hard. Like I know you've mentioned to me before, social events that you hustled hard for the first few years. What would be an example of your day? Was it legit proper 12-hour days out there pounding the pavement, or?
Hey, 12-hour days were days off. you know, the amount of effort it takes to build some momentum it cannot be underestimated. I would easily work 100-hour weeks, 120 easy. And, you know, given that I was doing everything in the business, I was lead generating, I was doing the marketing, I was doing the sales, I built the website, I did everything. So, you know, if I talk about what my average day looked like, I wouldn't even know where to start. It was so reactive, but you know, it was just whatever needed to be done whenever it needed to be done. And because I was in that growth phase, in that sort of startup entrepreneurial phase, like things were going off in my head, like ideas, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd have this breakthrough, which what I thought was a breakthrough. I'd write it down in the morning and be like, oh, that made no sense at all, and just throw it away. But you know, sometimes I couldn't sleep. I was buzzing, and I'd be thinking like, I was always innovating, always thinking like, how can I make something so compelling, you know, for customers? And that's when I sort of broke into the commercial space, and I was like, well, this is working in residential. So I did like 1.1 million in the first year. And then I hired someone to come in and sort of run most of the operations. And he used to be my boss at the first soda company that I worked for. So he came to work for me, and he sort of took care of most things, which was really good. And that allowed me to focus on sales and strategy and business development. So we went from 1.1 million to 6.6 million straight up. Year two, jumped up 6.5 mil.
Not bad.
Yeah, but I couldn't believe it. It was crazy.
Did you find your life so much easier when he took care of all the admin, all the ops stuff?
Not easier, but he was doing things that I didn't want to do. You know, like organizing installations and procuring equipment, and that wasn't fun to me.
Your sales.
Yeah, I wanted to be customer focused. I wanted to be managing a sales team. I wanted to be marketing, you know, split testing ads to see which ones were effective. That was what I enjoyed. So bringing him on enabled me to do that. And if it wasn't for bringing Ben on, I couldn't have done that. You know, so you know, I recognize that a lot of where the business is because of Ben, and Ben allowing me to do what I needed to do. And it's not just Ben; it's everybody. You know, at the end of the day, I'm only as successful as the people that are working for me. And if they're not doing a good job, the company's not going to be successful. So, yeah, that was good. I had to. We'll probably touch on it later, but one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in business, if not the hardest thing, was having to make Ben redundant after the transaction. So that was tough.
Because before, when you were doing the telemarketing, you're like, I burnt out from doing it, and then ironically, you've gone to work for yourself and you're probably working more hours. Did you find you were getting burnt out during that, or you found a different motivation because it's yours and it's your company and your money?
Yeah, you sort of burnout isn't something that happens and then it's gone. You can feel burnt out every other day. You know, it depends on so many factors, and it's certainly for me that it's been that way. But yeah, I was burnt out because what I was doing was not sustainable. You know, it was so high pressure and so high income, but it was commission only, and you could never build any stability like that. So I just got over that, and that's when I sort of decided to obviously go and start my own thing. But the hours that I work now are, you know, always way higher than they ever would have been working for somebody else, and I'm more burnt out. But at least now the juice is worth the squeeze.
It's yours, yeah.
Yeah.
There's this weird magical, I don't know what it is, energy or whatever. When it's yours, you're okay doing 100 hours a week. But when it's for someone else, you're like, I don't want to do that. Even though the money might be more, I don't know. Maybe it's like a pride thing, or like, I don't know. It's for me anyway, I think.
Yeah, well, I think I think if you're an entrepreneur, you're always going to feel that way. Some people are just wired that way.
Yeah, true. How did you know? So yeah, you yourself, and then you're Ben, and then obviously at some point you had to bring more people on. At what point did you know, okay, it's time to bring X person in for this role?
Well, back then, everything felt not too good to be true, but it was too good to be true. So I was just like, how do I keep this momentum? And my focus was always sales. As long as you're making sales, you've got a business. So it was always like the next thing would be to hire salespeople until such a point where the operations team couldn't keep up with the sales volume. Because once installation time frame started slipping past 4 to 6 weeks, customers would go with someone else because they didn't want to wait 3 months. So then you'd be like, okay, we'll bring in another operations person to manage that additional throughput. And so it's maintaining that balance. But back in the early days, my focus was always making sure that at least 50% of my workforce were in profit center roles and 50% were in cost center roles. So I was always like, each salesperson will offset someone. And that was just, in my mind, what I thought. And I'm not saying that's necessarily always the right way to run a business, but that was certainly how it was in my mind.
So it works for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is, in solar industry, is customer retention a thing? Like, in a sense that you come to me, I obviously buy my package from you. Do I then really need to speak to you again, or?
Not really, no.
Yeah. So
which is
finding new customers every
time.
Yeah,
it's transactional. There's no sort of, you do get repeat customers, people you've installed a system for 10 years ago, they've moved home and they give you a call. So you do get that, but there's no annuity that comes out of residential solar. It's transactional based.
Yeah.
And the difficulty is the solar industry is unregulated. Technically it's regulated and it has accreditation frameworks, but nobody enforces it. And if you actually look at the statistics in the industry, there's been examples where reports have been published showing that over 50% of all residential solar systems installed are substandard.
Yeah, right.
And that's because you see these guys advertising solar on TV for $4,000. I cannot do it for $4,000 while being compliant.
So where are they cutting? Like what are they saving costs?
Some of them might have 90% of their workforce overseas. And then, so I know one company in particular, they've about 200 staff, 180 of them are in a call center in Mumbai, and 20 of them are based here in Australia. So their overhead is very low.
Yeah.
And they're a high volume business. But what they typically do is they get to a point where they've made a ton of sales, things start going wrong, their brand starts tanking online, and then they Phoenix and start again under a new brand. Yeah. And I've seen that happen so many times. And unfortunately, consumers in the residential space in Australia are particularly fickle, and they get so emotionally attached to that cheap price that logic just goes out the window. Yeah. And I'm there trying to justify a similar system or a similar package for 30 to 50% more. And you're explaining why. And all of those reasons are perfectly valid reasons, but they're so emotionally wed to that cheap price that they will take the risk on. And then you hear from them 2, 3, 4 years down the track, and you want to say, told you so.
Of course.
But they've already installed the solar. They're not going to remove it and install a new one. So you only have one shot at a customer. It's not like that customer will come back and buy another one in 6 months. Yeah, it's a once-off investment. So now the issue with that is that drives unscrupulous conduct, right? And the majority of the solar industry will run on commission-only sort of models. So the sales guys are on comms only. Now, let's say you're a salesperson and you get to Friday afternoon and you haven't made a sale and you need to get paid because you need to feed the family, and you've got one customer left on a Friday afternoon. You're going to say whatever it is that you need to say to get that customer over the line.
You got to eat.
Yes, exactly. And that's that type of model just drives that type of behavior. It's unavoidable.
Yeah, okay. And then it obviously is a detriment to the industry.
Yeah, and that's why we see 50% of systems are substandard. I think Choice magazine posted something like 30 to 35% of consumers are not getting the outcomes that they were promised. And people are evading tax. It's the pink bats, a roof insulation scheme all over again, and it just continues over and over. So it makes it frustrating because it's really difficult to compete against those companies doing that type of business model, and they're so high volume. They do like, some of them are doing 250 to 300 million a year. And
is that because they just have call center calls just pumping?
Yep.
Pumping? Yeah. Would you say that's probably one of the biggest roadblocks in scale? Not now, even now, but like back when you were scaling up, was that probably the biggest roadblock for obstructing your growth? It was like competitors and the lowballing and stuff.
It was actually. It not just that. I think you think about your business strategy, and you're sort of always going to get diminishing returns in whatever it is that you do, unless you diversify. And all of my leads were self-generated. I was doing the marketing, and I was generating the leads through Facebook and Google Ads. And you can only put so much money into that before you start seeing your ad 4, 5, 6 times over. So you're continually paying for impressions on people that are not buying. So you just get diminishing returns. So if you want scale, you've got to think about a different marketing channel. And so is that TV advertising? And I never did TV. I never did radio. And the reason I didn't was because I couldn't see what the cost per acquisition would be. Whereas I knew if I dropped 10 grand into Facebook marketing, I would get 100 grand return or $1 million return. Whereas if I put 10 grand into TV, I had no idea. Yeah. And TV companies would come at me and be like, oh, let's do this campaign. I was like, yeah, I will give you 500 grand for marketing if you can guarantee me a certain cost per acquisition. And obviously they can't. So it's just like, well, why would I speculate and put my money into that where I can put my money into this? And I haven't exhausted that marketing channel yet to the point where I'm seeing diminishing returns. So it didn't make sense. So I wasn't really willing to speculate because, as a transactional startup, you don't know how viable you are. You don't know how long the business is going to go. So I was very risk adverse, and I just put the money into the things that I wanted to. And, truthfully, I didn't want to grow too big. I was just quite happy where I was. I never had the intention of scaling to $100 million a year because I didn't want the hassle. I didn't want the pressure. I didn't want the stress. I was just happy enough doing what I was doing.
Yeah. When besides like revenue, EBITDA, what KPIs do you use to track if your company is sitting healthy?
The EBITDA is probably not the first thing I look at, and I know a lot of people will, but for me, it's I look at the things I look at daily are leads in, conversion rates, gross margin, and most importantly, I look at OPEX as a percentage of revenue. And that's not a metric that a lot of people look at. I was mentoring somebody recently, and they'd been running a business for 13 years. And he sort of said, this is not worth the hassle anymore. And I knew he had a good business, and I couldn't understand why. So I said, look, let me take a look at your book. So I asked for 3 years of P&L, 3 years of balance sheets. I got his staff headcount, and I wanted to know, what roles that each of these people were doing over that period. And I could see that his OPEX as a percentage of his revenue back in like 2019 was about 17, 18%, which I think is quite a sweet spot. So let's say he did $100,000 in revenue. It was costing him about $17,000 to $18,000 to do $100,000 in revenue. And I just looked at each financial year up until now, and his current OPEX is 37% as a percent of, and I'm just like, and he's pricing things at 35% gross margin. And I'm like, well, you're never going to be viable if your gross is 35 and your OPEX is 37. So it's just that they hadn't even considered that metric. So I like to look at that metric, and in order for any business, you need to be able to flex your OPEX as your revenue goes up and down. And every business, without fail, most businesses will see an increase in their OPEX year on year because wages go up. Your cost of goods go up, but it's not like you can constantly increase your price to the consumer by 3 or 4% each year, because you always get new entrants come into the market that haven't had that cost creep. They undercut you. So you're sort of dictated by your price in the market. So you need to make sure that your OPEX always stays at a certain level. And that's why you hear companies like Amazon and Tesla letting go of 10, 20% of their staff, because they have to constantly flex down their cost base to stay viable.
They kept hiring for roles that they didn't need, and they go, hang on a minute.
Yeah, well, that happens in any business, and that's typically driven by governance and risk and middle management, and I've certainly felt the pain of that.
Where would you say generalizing, because obviously every company is different, where would you say most people not waste costs, but waste costs in their OPEX? Is it like the wages increase and adding staff they don't need? Is that the common one?
Yeah, but sometimes you don't know what staff you don't need. You almost need a different perspective. I think organizations get a bit lazy. The longer you have the business running and I thought, probably 7 or 8 years into the business, I had about 4.8 years, I think it was, as average tenure of my staff. And I thought that was great. Like, all my staff love working here, but people get comfortable. And, I made what I would now call a mistake in hiring a lot of friends. And that was a huge challenge. And I don't think I'd ever do that again. While I do recognize that hiring my friends created a culture and a vibe in the business that also contributed to the success of the business, not worth the hassle.
Because of, like, when it comes to performance reviewing and firing. And
exactly. And I had one staff member, and he was with me for 5 years, and he was good. He was good. I hadn't seen him for 2 months. He just wasn't coming into the office, and I'd ask him where he was, and he'd get defensive over it.
Yeah.
And performance managing friends, they cannot distinguish the difference between a professional environment and a personal environment. So it just became really difficult, and I lost a lot of friends that were friends that I hired, and I lost them because I had to let them go, and they took it personally. And then I'd changed. All of a sudden, I wasn't the same bloke that I was, and I recognized that I wasn't, but I had to, because ultimately my responsibility was to the business and all of the employees, not to the one individual. So that was that was always a challenge.
Yeah, and the irony is, like, well, if you're doing your job, you wouldn't have to have the conversation.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah. What's when it comes to financial forecasting for you, how do you balance like growth with profitability? So obviously, you need sometimes to spend a bit of cash to grow, but then you want to, like you're talking about, you need to keep your OPEX lows. How do you ensure, like, you have sustainable growth? What are some measures?
That sustainable growth is difficult. If you're looking to set EBITDA sort of records or net profit records year on year, but you also want to heavily invest in growth, it's difficult to do that. What I've always done in the past is I've secured a bunch of big contracts, and I've said, okay, well, that's a $20 million contract. I know that I'm going to gross maybe 6 million off of that. I know that I'm going to deliver that over the next 2 years. So that's 3 million gross per year on top of my normal business. So I'm like, okay, I know I'm going to have some profit there that I can invest into various channels. So you you target those prime profit windows, and then you use that to invest. So even after the investment, I'd still recorded a better profit than I had the previous years, just because I'd timed the investment.
Yeah.
The difficulty with growth is if your back's against the wall sometimes, and it is in business, it ebbs and flows. When your back's against the wall, you're scraping by, and what you're doing isn't working, you need to change, right? It's a step change. How do you do that without investment? That's the challenge. That's always the challenge. And how I typically manage that, and I'm going through it right now actually, is I'll reallocate some of my current resources into testing this different strategy. And when you do that, you're never going to have a great result, because you're only dabbling, and really sometimes you just need to go all in. But you test it, you get some results over a short window, and then you're like, okay, that's viable, I can now invest. But you have to manage the timing. So right now, for example, I'm thinking about introducing an outbound business development strategy. But now is not the right time, because I'm leading into Christmas, and then December and January are slow. So, for me, it's like, okay, well, let's just set it up now. Let's get the strategy right, and then let's think about recruiting the last week of January. We go through the training for 3 or 4 weeks in Feb, hit the ground running in March, and March is when things start taking off.
Everyone's back at work.
Exactly. Yeah.
You said, you touched on before, like, hiring friends did create a good culture, but obviously the consequences were later. What other things do you do to keep or maintain culture?
Yeah. So I hired friends, and they were good because, like, I mean, the parties that we threw. You know, I bumped into somebody. I moved to a new area recently, and I bumped into one of the neighbors, and she knew who I was, and she said, "Oh, you used to be somebody's boss." And I was like, "Oh, I did. How did you know about that?" And she was like, "Oh, we always used to hear about the parties." And I was like, "What have you heard specifically?"
Yeah.
You know, and she listed off some of the parties that she heard about, and I was like, "Yeah, no, they were wild." I think I remember one weekend I spent 120 grand, booked out elements of Byron down at Byron, took the whole company, the friends, like the families. It was wild. I hired a super yacht up from Sydney for a night one day. The yacht came up, had limos pick everybody up at the office. Everyone was dressed as like Great Gatsby theme. It was wild.
Giving recruitment company vibes.
Yeah. And, you know, but that was me reinvesting profits back into the business to form culture, right? The problem is when you personally start buying things for yourself out of the profit, and people are saying, "I want a pay rise." And I'm like, well, you're already getting paid above market rate for the role. Just because I've got something doesn't mean that I should pay you more. And that's the problem you get with hiring friends. But if I think about how I manage culture now, you know, culture is, I'm obviously the CEO. It really is up to me to drive culture. But I like to ask people, you know, what they think culture means to them, and if there's anything we can do to improve. And I will say my partner Lily has been really good in helping drive culture. She's always got some really creative ideas, and I think managing culture now, especially when so many people want to work from home, is really difficult. And we had a flexible working policy where we let people work from home 2 days a week. But people take the piss when they work from home. I know they do. Everybody knows they do. Everybody knows it. So I said, I want 1 day from home, 4 days in the office. And I had a lot of pushback on that. So what we started doing was things like on a Tuesday afternoon, I'd look at who's in the office and I'd book a lunch. I'd take the whole company out for lunch. And because we have a really good culture and a tight-knit group of people, they were always fun. I'd be shouting beers for everybody at lunch. And the people that were working from home would be devastated they missed. And they would be like, well, you never told me? I was like, that's the intent. It's like, you're in the office, you get to benefit.
Yeah.
So we bring in like breakfasts, like, you know, like we go to bakeries and bring in some, you know, Danishes or whatever. And that, you know, when you do that, the whole company comes together in one location, everybody's vibing, it's good. And that sort of really drives culture. And I think if you're going to push your staff hard, and I do have high expectations of my staff, particularly given how much I pay them, then you need to balance it with nice incentives like that. So I think I'm focused on a performance culture, but a performance culture while having fun and while giving people flexibility. Like one of the guys is you had to work last weekend finalizing a report for me, and I'm just like, you know, take a couple of days in lieu. And I'll take him out to dinner, him and his wife out to dinner somewhere like SK, and that's somewhere that then they're never going to go on their own.
Yes,
so just
dinner. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really like to look after my staff, and I think that repays itself.
Yeah, I agree. I think what the problem a lot of companies do is they expect a high performance culture, but they pay peanuts.
That sounds like an American business.
Yeah. Whereas if you expect someone to bust their ass for you, it's like, well, yeah, you get paid well, but every now and then here's a reward as a thank you and stuff like that. I think it goes a long way.
Yeah, so
like I send appreciation.
I send guys on overseas trips. You know, recently sent a couple of guys over to China. They got to tour around a bunch of facilities. Whole thing was paid for. One of them had never been overseas. You know, and his first trip overseas was a company
paid trip.
Yeah, a couple of years ago. I took some lads to Intersolar in Munich in Germany, you know, and that was awesome. We got to tour some manufacturing facilities in Austria, Germany. The company that I went with, one of our main suppliers, had booked out the Allianz Arena, which is the Bayern Munich football stadium. So we got to go and have champagne on the pitch. I was upstairs playing kick-ups with Lothar Matthäus we had a hall of about 200 guests, and he came up onto stage and he had these awful Gucci shoes on. They were like, you know, with the spikes and all gold, they were awful. and someone was asking questions. I asked him if he could still do kick-ups. And he said he could, and I said, even in those shoes. So he obviously felt the need to prove to me he could. Now, the reason I did this was because, there was actually 10 soccer balls that he had signed. And I spoke to the managing director of the manufacturer, and I said, I want one of the balls. He's like, oh, they can't. They'll all be allocated through a draw or something. I said, I'm getting one of those balls.
Scuff it up.
Yeah. So I challenged Lothar to some kick. After he did the kick-ups, he put it back on me and said, "Couldn't you do kick-ups?" And I, obviously being English, I played football growing up, and I could. So he called me up in front of everybody. I did some kick-ups. He shook my hand and gave me the ball. And I was like, "Thank you very much." Like a cheeky little wink to the director and said, "I told you I'd get one." That was good. So lots of perks like that for staff, and yeah, it doesn't cost a lot. But it means like I could have given them a $3,000 bonus or an experience that they'll remember forever.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. Like, yeah, the experiences are worth more. Like not
absolutely.
dollar value wise, but
you can't value it. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously I guess you breed a high performance culture. What are some qualities you look for? Because as your company's grown, you've had to hire some leadership staff. What are qualities you look for when you're hiring like execs or leadership staff?
Oh, look, to be honest, I haven't, since I've been having to hire execs, I haven't had all the say in it, just given I went through a transaction, I sold half the business. But one of the things that I've learned is that you do need some jack of all trades in the business. But some roles need specialists. You need people that just know everything about that role. And if I was to give an example, somebody in safety and risk, you want a safety and risk specialist. Yeah. You don't want someone that's dabbled a little bit. Whereas if you've got someone in an operations role, you want somebody that has like quite a diverse skill set, a jack of all trades and a master of none. More than ever, I've realized that when hiring, you really need to find the right cultural fit, and you need to find somebody that looks at things through a particular lens. And if I'm talking about a lens, give you an example. Somebody could come into a position as a COO or general manager, and they might come in with a strong background on risk and governance. Now, what they're going to look at is everything around risk governance, and the first thing that people do is say, we need to recruit for this. We need to hire someone for IT. We need to do this and we need to do that. And when you hire like that, you're just going to increase your OPEX, right? You increase your OPEX, and then all of a sudden you end up with 60 to 70% of your workforce in a cost center role and 30% in a profit center role. And I think depending on the size of your business, if you're a Telstra, you have an elevated level of risk and governance, and you should be looking at specialists in that area. But as a small to medium business, you always need to look through a commercial lens. You need to weigh up your risk and governance requirements against the size of your business and the risk that sits within your business. You shouldn't be taking, the same sort of approach to risk and governance as Telstra or a business like that would. It has to be fit for purpose. And, I'm sort of, if I think about succession planning for any role in the future, the first thing that I'm looking at is what does that role need? Not the individual, what does that role need? And then I'm looking for people that have the skill set to fit that role.
Are you still small enough that you have a hand in a lot of the hiring process? Like, I'm assuming you have a HR person by now.
We did, but no, I got rid of them.
Not anymore. So you do most of that, like the hiring?
No, it depends on the level of the role, I suppose. I'm not going to be active in hiring a warehouse manager.
Yeah.
In saying that, I know the warehouse manager well. I know every single one of my employees. But if it's a sales role, I'm hiring for that. Like I will
That's
personally,
your bread and butter.
Right down the bottom to the lowest sales role, I'm hiring for that role. And I'll interview people and I'll have them pitch me in the interview. I don't care about your previous experience. I want you to sell me this pen.
I was going to make that joke.
When the CEO of the business is asking you to do that, people are going to get nervous.
Oh, yeah.
And if they can perform under that pressure, you've got a keeper. So I'll be actively involved in sort of any of the executive roles, obviously, any of the sales roles. But outside of that, I typically leave that to the heads of.
Yeah.
I don't want to step on their toes all the time. So I leave them run their own business units, but I'll just step in where I need to.
Yeah. So 2013, you started. So 11 years now. I imagine the industry has changed quite a lot since then.
Yeah.
Do you think it's changed for the better, for the worse? What are some big changes that have affected you?
It's changed from a regulatory perspective. So many more regulations now, and that's not a bad thing generally, but when you over-regulate something, you can end up with higher percentages of non-conformance, because if you lift that regulatory bar that high that it's not commercially feasible to hit it, then that will drive some operators to just do things.
Not even care.
Yeah. So, and that's why if you actually look at the percentage of systems going in substandard year on year, we're seeing an increase. We're seeing an increase of substandard, and that's driven by low consumer pricing. Australia is the cheapest country in the world to install solar. It's cheaper to install solar here than it is in China, where the panels are made.
Interesting.
The margins here are so much lower than anywhere else. Like in America, a 5 kilowatt system would be about 15,000 US. You can buy it from some companies here for $2,500 Australian. So it's just there's been cases where teams doing the installations on the roof, not a single one of them is qualified, and there's somebody in India signing off to say that they were there and they installed it.
Yeah, right.
So that's
they just don't give a fuck.
Yeah, so it's regulated.
What are the consequences of that if they get caught? Is it harsh enough? Sounds like
it's not harsh enough.
Yeah, it sounds like, because you're like, I'll just liquidate all Phoenix and.
Yeah, and that's what we see over. Or we'll give you a $250,000 fine, but when you're generating $250 million a year, it's irrelevant. Yeah,
factor that
you almost just have a laugh. Plan. You're just like, whoa, sign off.
Yeah.
But so I think the industry is similar in many ways. In the residential space, it's more regulated, but there's more competition now than there's ever been as well. So, it's like 7,500 competitors. And we're all selling the same sort of equipment, the same brands. So how do you differentiate?
Yeah,
it's difficult. Yeah. So you see, obviously, when that happens, you see margin erosion. But commercial is so different. The commercial sector is so different
because of all the big push for net zero and stuff.
Yeah. So, 5 or 6 years ago, nobody even cared about that. It would be everything was about an internal rate of return, and it had to be 15% or 20% or whatever it needed to be. Now we have consumers investing without even caring about the IRR. Because to give you an example, some of the big mining companies, it's actually a real example. One of the big mining companies in WA have started weighting tenders based on the percentage of emissions reductions that each organization is committed to. So they're going out and saying 30% of this tender is weighted on price, 10% is weighted on sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a company come to us, and they'd be the incumbent logistics provider for this mining company for about 20 years. The tender came up, and they had nothing in the way of sustainability. And this company had signed off on a $1.8 million investment within 5 days. Companies do not, they're a big company with significant governance hoops, but that's how desperately they needed to move on solar.
Yeah.
So commercial is driven by that. And if I think about some of the projects that we're doing now, we're not even installing solar on some buildings. We're just putting a battery onto the site. Only a battery. And that battery isn't even doing anything to support the building. It's just participating with the wholesale electricity markets. So during the day, the cost of energy gets to negatives because there's so much surplus solar coming into the grid that it's forcing the load below the baseline. So the network are paying people to turn appliances on to take load off the grid. So if you've got a battery, you can charge your battery in the middle of the day. Then at night, when the solar comes off and everybody turns the air cons on at home and starts cooking, you have a big spike in demand on the grid, and that battery will discharge back into the grid at that time. So it can generate revenue twice per day sometimes.
Yeah, okay.
And you can have a battery, to give you an idea, let's say a 1 megawatt hour battery, which is a 1,000 kilowatt hour battery. That could generate up to, the wholesale cost of energy can hit about $16,000 per megawatt hour. So one charge of that battery during the middle of the day can generate $16,000 in revenue. And then later in that evening, if it hits 16,000 again, it could discharge at 16,000.
It disperses, you say discharge is dispersing the energy back out?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you could generate $32,000 in a single day, theoretically. That battery would cost about 1.2 million to install. Yeah. So we're seeing 3-year paybacks on just batteries participating with the grid. And the more instability we see in the grid, the higher the revenue capture is.
Yeah, okay. Is the push for that from the bigger corporations, is the push the monetary ROI, or is the push governing, hey, you need to get to net zero, like, because there's a lot of that happening?
It's a bit of both.
Yeah.
So those batteries do nothing for sustainability.
Yeah.
But they generate a really good commercial return. So they're
obviously helping the grid, which the government wants you to help the grid.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And this is the thing, like EVs will play a really big part in supporting the grid, because there's going to be vehicle to grid and vehicle to home. So you'll get to there will be a point where you'll go to work during the day. Let's say you work for a big business and they've got 500 car parks. They'll all have EV chargers at each car park. So you're charging your car off of the grid during the day, and you may be getting paid to do that. Then you go home, you plug your car in at home, and then you run your house off your car. You think about Tesla Powerball, which is the battery that people install at home. It's a $16,000 investment for the battery, and it has about 13 kilowatt hours. You can go and buy a Tesla Model 3 that's got 60 to 70 kilowatt hours for 30 grand now.
Yeah.
So you got like 5 times the capacity.
Only double the price.
Yeah, and you've got a car out of it too.
Yeah.
So and what that does is that smooths the grid, right? So at the moment, nobody wants to invest in poles and wires because nobody's using the poles and wires. It's all localized generation and storage. So, but if you as a homeowner are currently using a whole bunch of power from the grid, you install a solar and a battery, that frees up capacity on existing infrastructure. So we can bring more connections onto the same infrastructure without having to upgrade the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now that means you've got more users on less infrastructure, which will lower the cost of power for everybody.
Everybody's winning.
So people talk about renewables, and coal's good and long live coal, and there is a place for it at the moment, but renewables like that are what's going to ultimately lead to lower cost of energy. Lower cost of energy means manufacturing businesses are more viable because they can compete with international manufacturers unless they're employing Australian labor, because that is expensive. But yeah, it's renewables will be a very good thing for Australia.
Do you think that's where it's heading?
Yeah, it has to.
Yeah.
Yeah, you look at Europe. Europe are starting to impose tariffs on some countries if the country isn't net zero or hasn't made a commitment to it. So you think about the government over here have committed to 50% by 2035 or whenever it is. They have to do that. Otherwise, there'll be tariffs imposed on Australian sort of exports, which is going to kill Australian businesses.
Yeah.
There's the things that people aren't thinking about.
Do you think it'll take, because there's obviously a generation, we'll just generalize, like the boomers are probably stuck in that sort of coal era.
Yeah.
Our generation's sort of maybe half, and I think down are very pro. Do you think it'll just take a generation and then everybody will be super pro renewables?
The next generation coming through now, the kids in schools now are super pro renewable already. I was speaking to one of the local colleges, a big college, which we're hopefully going to contract about a 1 megawatt system for. It's a very big system on a school. And they told me that it's the students and the teachers driving the investment. And I'm offering them 3.8 year payback.
Yeah.
It's a no-brainer as
well.
School
will be there for 30 years or whatever.
You get the financial return, you get the emissions reduction. It's businesses that don't have solar, like honestly, I just can't contemplate it, because you use all your power during the day. You install a solar system, it runs during the day. And if you can get a 30% return using your existing budget, because you have to pay for power anyway, you get zero return from buying power from the grid.
Yeah.
You get 30%.
You get a bill.
But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been operating for over 11 years. You went through COVID and I'm sure many other fires that you've done. Is there any that you can share maybe that you kind of thought, fuck, this is it, like everything I've worked for is on the edge here? Like how was COVID for you guys? Was that
rough, mate?
Rough?
Yeah, we were premium sort of in the market, so we're obviously a little bit more expensive, but we use premium equipment, we have quality control, all of those things that come at a cost. But so we hurt, but other cheap companies that, you know, the high volume guys, they were killing it. They were booming. And I think that's because everyone was concerned about what was happening. Everybody was at home, so they were using more power. So they wanted solar, but they couldn't justify buying something premium. So they were just going cheap. So we really suffered. I think we probably had a 30 to 40% reduction in revenue. So we obviously flexed down our cost base as much as we could, but yeah, that hurt. But that wasn't the point where I was thinking, oh, I could lose the business here. I've never thought that. There's a couple of times where if you were looking at the business from the outside, you would have thought that, but I know the business, I know what the business can do. And I know that, you know, particularly when my back is against the wall, that's when I work the best. So I've never been worried about that. Recently, it's, you know, there has been some rough years, but we're sort of very firmly back in charge of things now. And yeah, we've seen a recovery, which is good.
Yeah. So you kind of always back yourself that no matter how big the hole is, you'll dig your way out.
There's not a single percentage of doubt in my mind about what I can do in that business.
Yeah. Do you think that's come from 11 years of doing it and facing all the different challenges?
Yeah, it is. And it's just, yeah, it is. I think every challenge I've faced, we've overcome. You know, it's not me that's overcoming those challenges. It's a collective effort, but we've gone through it all now. And, you know, business is, you know, particularly when you're in an executive role, it's about how well you deal with the problems and move forward. Yeah. So yeah, I've never had any concerns really. I think, you know, the space is still a good area. It's not booming anymore. It has sort of tapered off and it's very saturated. But I think as long as you can offer customers the right value proposition and you retain your integrity and your ethics, I think there's always going to be a place for you in business.
As the company grows, you know, the problems grow, then usually stress and stuff comes with that. Do you have any things that you do personally to manage stress or kind of decompress or anything like that?
Yeah. I used to work out quite a lot, and I found that working out in the morning would make a materially sort of different. I'd have a materially different approach to the day if I'd worked out in the morning. If I'd worked out too hard, I'd feel a bit exhausted. So it's just finding that balance. Too much pre-workout, you'd start feeling anxious. You'd never have a good day on that.
So lunchtime crash.
Yeah. So I think eating cleaner than I used to, working out. That was really how I managed my stress. And I don't have any kids. I just got a couple of dogs, and I love them, you know, a lot. So they're really good for stress. And obviously my partner is great as well. She can see when I've had a rough day, and she's really supportive. And so I think it's really those things. I think socializing as well is really good for stress management. But unfortunately, when you are stressed, it's, for someone like me, that's the last thing I want to do when I'm stressed. I'm a bit of an introvert. So I just want to be left at home. And, you know, sometimes I'll open up the Xbox and I'll play it for half an hour and be like, I might have liked that when I'm younger, but not anymore. So you manage stress as best you can. But really the best way for me to manage stress, because stress is normally coming from a problem or something, is to solve that issue, overcome that challenge, and then your stress will fade.
Yeah, okay. Same thing, as the company's grown, obviously you kind of become more and more of a leader. You know, you create your heads of departments, but you still have to lead them. Do you think you Like when you were younger, were you a natural leader or you've evolved?
Oh, definitely not. Absolutely
No?
not. No.
Did you do anything specifically on purpose to better yourself? Like, did you do courses or mentoring or anything like that?
No.
You just evolved as the business has
Yeah,
evolved?
yeah, and like even in the last 3 months, I've had to completely change my management style, and I think having that awareness of, and I don't have the highest IQ, but I do have good EQ. Like I can see how people are feeling, and I think that allows me to sort of take pressure off them when I need to. But also, as a leader, you have to make hard decisions sometimes. And you just have to do it. So I think my approach to management has changed multiple times over the years, and sometimes it can change week to week. If I'm not getting the results from someone, or I've asked someone to do something and they haven't do it, I will give them the cold shoulder, and I have to do that, and I'll be less approachable. But I think the reason why I've been, I don't like the word successful, but I think the reason why the business has done as well as it has done is because I've been engaged with all of my staff. We have 65 staff plus can have up to 100 contractors working for us at any time. And I know all of my staff. I know what their interests are. And I think being an engaging leader, like ultimately as the CEO, I really should be in helicopter view and sat on top of the business. And I should have 3 or 4 direct reports, and I manage them and I manage the strategy. But I'm really operationally involved in the business, like all the way down to the point where I'm listening to the residential sales guys on the phone. I'm listening to them pitch. I'm refining their pitch. I try to be involved everywhere I can. And the people will come to me and bypass 2 levels of management because they've been working on a solution for a week to a problem, and they come to me and within 10 seconds I've solved it. And it's just because of my experience in the industry. So I want to be there. I want to be accessible. But the downside to that is I don't have enough time to close the door and just think about, what do we need to do for the business, and to drive strategy. So it's really difficult being so operationally involved and, effectively being an effective CEO. And that largely has come because of the transaction and the fact that, I had a lot of turnover of staff and I don't have the same experience in the business anymore. So I have to be operationally involved.
Yeah. Well, we'll go to the transaction part now. So I actually can't remember, maybe a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So the transaction for me started in 2018, 2019, where the business had grown to about 35 million a year at that point, and we were the largest privately owned commercial solar business in the country. So I felt like the prettiest girl in the room. Every private equity company was calling me. I had venture capitalists, like energy retailers, and I got close to signing off on a couple of PE transactions. But the reason I didn't was because I was already feeling quite exhausted from growing the business, and I knew that if I sold to PE, they'd push the business hard because
PE, private equities.
Yeah, because what they would be looking to do is invest in the business, grow the business, and then exit the business. And I just didn't have it in me at that point. Ultimately, on reflection, it could have been a good option. It's the value of hindsight.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it started in about 2018, 2019, and over the course of a couple of years, I'd sort of, one of them, they just wanted to buy the business. Another one wanted to buy my business plus 2 or 3 other businesses, roll those businesses up. And I think the collective revenue of that group would have been about 150 million. They wanted to grow that to about 250 million and then list it or sell it to an institutional investor or go to a big energy retailer like AGL and Origin and say, look, we've got this $250 million a year business that's generating this much solar and this much carbon emissions reductions, and those big heavy polluters, it's a big tick for them to say, oh, we've invested 250 million, where it might be in the renewables. Yeah, so that's sort of where it started. And ultimately, after about 2 years, I settled on a party with the transaction, and that was just as sort of COVID hit. I remember I got the term sheet came. The term sheet came on a Friday afternoon, and I just needed to check on a couple of clauses. We'd gone through the sort of terms and conditions, and they knew that I was going to sell to someone else. They came in and sort of matched the offer, and I felt like they were a better fit. And I got to seeing the term sheet, and I was like, yeah, we're on here. A couple of things to sort of work through, but we'll sign on Monday morning. And this was on a Friday arvo. And I've been looking, and first thing I did, which I'd highly recommend people not to do, is I went and spent like $2.5 million on an apartment down the Gold Coast on the beach with the money that I thought I was going to get. And then the first COVID lockdown happened in Melbourne on the Saturday after that Friday. And then the transaction just got parked. And I was like, yeah, sweet, I'm committed to this apartment. Yeah, so then it took about 2.5 years, and we were under due diligence for about 18 months. And that was brutal for the business because I didn't have the skill sets within the business to manage the transaction for me. So I was managing the transaction while also trying to manage the business and the commercial pipeline and things like that. So I was spread far too thin, and it had such a big negative impact on the business. I think our revenue softened from about 40 something to 28 because of it.
So because you essentially took your foot off the gas
because
bouncing this over here.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I would never ever enter a transaction again unless it had a drop dead date on it. I said, and most due diligence will typically last, from what I understand, 8 to 12 weeks. This lasted
18 months.
Yeah. So
why did it drag? Do you know why it dragged on so long?
Just because COVID was happening, and they didn't commit to a time. Well, they did commit to a couple of times, and it slipped, and it slipped, and it slipped, and there was changes of staff on their end, and then things were like, oh, well, the performance is starting to soften in the business. Well, let's wait and see what next month looks like. And all that did was give them the opportunity to keep asking more questions. So it got to the point where you sort of like, you're exhausted. You're exhausted trying to manage a transaction. And, given going through a transaction like that from somebody that is a founder and an entrepreneur, it's a life-changing thing. So you're so emotionally invested into it already, but, it becomes tiring. But yeah, so that happened. We executed about 2.5 years ago, maybe. Yeah. So life's been completely different since the transaction.
Yeah. What was because obviously beforehand, were you thinking about selling any percentages? Like, because you said every man and his dog was after you. And then, at some point you changed your mind. What was it that made you go, I do want to?
I think I felt like with my skill set, and this is maybe is just a lack of belief in myself. I was like, I've taken the business as far as I can take it on my own. And I think in order for me to take this further, I'm going to need a partner, and I'm going to need a partner that knows how to run a big business, that knows how to grow a business. And that's what really drove me to seeking an investor. Really, I should have just backed myself. I think I could have, but the question was really, did I want to? Did I want to keep pushing? And I was never that financially that motivated. So for me, it was just like, I was in a sweet spot. I was making, good money. I'd had everything I wanted in life, and I just didn't need to keep growing the business. I think I could have grown it to well over 100 million on my own. But I just didn't want the stress or the hassle of it, honestly.
Double-edged sword.
It is, yeah.
What made you, obviously without sort of revealing who it is, what made you choose this particular investment group or investor? Their position in the market, their customer database, and I think while commercial's really good, the benefit of having a commercial and a residential business is cash flow. So resi is quick; it's in and out. It's 4 to 6 week turnaround on cash. You typically have, if you structure your trade finance facilities or your accounts correctly, you might have 60 to 90 day payment terms. So if I made a sale and I had that system installed within 4 weeks, I'd receive all the cash, and my cash outflows only happened 6 to 8 weeks later. So it was great for cash. And what that did was it smoothed out the lumpiness of the commercial business, because you could go 3 months without signing a commercial contract and bang, a 20 million contract. Yeah. And then, but resource planning for that type of business is always really a challenge in itself. Peaks and troughs.
Yeah. So that was, and these guys, they've got the really good brand. They're a fantastic business. They've been around for a very long time. And I was like, this is the company that can come in really helped me grow that side of the business.
Since the takeover, the transaction, what is it, generalizing, obviously without really specifics, like what have been some pros and cons of taking on big shareholders or selling a share?
Yeah, look, I think the pros are the support around you. It tends to, if you've got the right people, you get a bit more support. And for me, I'd never had a mentor. I didn't know anybody that was in my position that had started a business from being a backpacker to 40 million a year. So I didn't have anybody that I could ask questions to. I didn't have like I've got a friend group, but my friend group are people that I was backpacking with or, whatever. So they came in and added a different perspective on things. And they came in and certainly I look at risk and compliance and governance completely differently now. And I think that's really valuable in a business. I think every business needs that. Again, it needs to be fit for purpose. So they added that value. Whenever you sell to a big business, you're going to have integration challenges and you're going to have a difference of opinion on things. And for example, it used to cost me $6.5 million a year roughly to run the business in operating expenses, wages and rent and so on. And I've seen 60 to 70% increase in that without seeing an increase in revenue, because we needed HR, we needed an IT person, we needed a risk and safety person, we needed another layer of management, and it's that's always a challenge, especially if you're, depending on how you've structured your transaction. Some people will structure their transaction based on just a 100% equity sale. So, if your EBITDA was 5 million and you had a 7, let's say to 10 times multiple, to keep the numbers easy, 5 times, if you had 5 million EBIT and a 10 times multiple, you'd get a $50 million valuation, right? But if you're on an earnout, which is some people are structured on an earnout where you basically will get paid, let's say 50% up front based on your 10 times multiple, but then the rest of it is paid year on year based on performance. So if your performance target is an EBITDA number and you've just added $4 or $5 million to your operating expenses, and you've still got to maintain a 5 mil EBIT, all of a sudden you've got to generate 10 mil of EBIT just to end up where you were.
Yeah.
So, I would sort of always, my advice to anybody that's looking to sell their business would be to either sell 100% and stay on and be happy about that decision. And really, it's easy to feel like, oh, I've made it, and take your foot off the gas. Don't. That following 12 months after the transaction is when you should work the hardest, because you've started and created a good business and you want to hand a good business over at the end of your 12-month sort of contract or whatever it is. If you are only going to sell half, sell 100% of that half. Do not take an earn out on half. I also would say things like, well, if you are going to have an earn out, make sure that you have a contractual mechanism to move away from EBITDA as a mechanism for valuation and move to something like gross margin. Because, for example, if I'm generating 10 million of gross margin a year pre-transaction and my OPEX was like 5 million or whatever, then I'm generating 5 mil of EBIT. But then, if you're still generating 10 mil, you're doing all the same things that you would before. But if your OPEX is now 10 mil, you've got no EBIT. That's not really fair that you're paying that price. And I've heard, I'm not necessarily saying this is for my business, but other businesses that have been acquired in order to be rolled into a larger corporate, the large corporation will come and sink all the integration costs into your business while you're on an earnout, and then take the business off you for zero at the end because there's no value left in it, and then merge it into theirs, and you've paid the price for it.
They've shafted the
grade A stitch up. And I know that's happened a lot. So that can be really challenging. So yeah, just I think thinking about your mechanism. And I wasn't really thinking about this because I've sort of learned a lot post. I did have a gross margin mechanism put into my contract because I was conscious of that, but a lot of people I know haven't. So yeah.
And that can be a very expensive mistake.
Oh yeah.
$1 million mistake.
Yeah, I know one person that lost about 10 million for that.
Yeah.
And ultimately you've got no cash to go legal. What do you do?
Yeah. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, slap on the bum, off you go.
Yeah, thanks, champ. Let's go back to the very start. If there's someone who maybe similar to you, whether they're a backpacker or not, but a couple of quid in the bank and they're like, all right, this is the path that I want to go. What are some, I guess, advice you'd give to an entrepreneur who's ready to give it a crack at whatever the industry is?
You've got to be passionate. You have to be passionate about it, what it is that you're going to do. And you need to almost be able to do everything within the business. If you're speculating and you want to kick something off, you need to be able to do a bit of everything. Like for me, I could do it all. I could do the operations, the sales. I could, so I could do everything. If you're starting a business and you can't do everything, and you bring someone on with you, whether they're an equity partner or not, you have too much key person risk. So I just be conscious of who you bring on to start with. If you are going to bring friends on, you need a contract.
Shareholders agreement.
Yeah, you need a shareholders agreement that dictates how you manage your relationship, and you set those boundaries up front. Because I can tell you, as soon as money starts becoming real, everything changes. People change. So you want something ironclad. And me and Lily, we love watching Big Bang Theory, and Sheldon has contracts for everything, and he's hit the nail on the head. That's how it should be. Yeah. But yeah, so I think just be passionate, be willing to risk everything, because you have to. And if you don't take a risk, it will never pay off. Some of my strongest advice would be, don't tell everybody you're starting a business. Don't register a business and then set up an Instagram, get all your friends to follow it, because you set yourself up to fail. Keep it under wraps, keep it until such a point where you're like, I've got a good business here and I'm willing to talk about it. Because tall poppy syndrome in Australia is very real. And everybody wants you to be successful until you are successful. And then everybody wants to take some credit for you getting to where you've got to. So just keep things a bit private. Really think seriously about working with your friends. But most importantly, think about why you're starting the business. If you're starting the business to make 150 grand a year, don't bother, because you can go and get a job and make 150 grand a year. And the side of business, running a business, that you don't see is the lack of sleep, the stress, the pressure, the toll it takes on you as an individual. It is hard running a business, and you can have the watches and the Lamborghinis and the houses and all of that cool stuff, but that isn't happiness. And it's not worth it. So you think about why you're starting the business and what you want your exit to look like, and go into it setting a time frame for exit. Why are you starting the business? Do you want to start a family business? Let's say you want to start a mechanics shop, for example. Do you want to be the head mechanic and work on the cars forever? Do you want to start a franchise? Do you want to build the business and sell it to someone? If you do, who's going to want to buy that business? And is that business so heavily dependent on you as a key person that if you leave, there's no value in it? So you have to set the business up to be able to run without you in it. And, for all the things, the nice material things that I might have, I was at a dinner with a mate on, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, and he was telling me about a guy down in, I think, Kingscliff or around that area, who runs a soda business. It's only a small business. He works 2 hours a day, and he's got a general manager that runs everything, and he's just so happy. I think he's probably pulling 120, 150 a year out of the business.
But he's not doing anything.
He works 2 hours a day.
Yeah.
Oh, man. That just,
bliss.
And I hear that, and I'm like, that sounds like success to me. That sounds like happiness, and yeah, I know some people that started a business from nothing to $600 million valuation. Awesome. Like, epic. I'm so happy for them, and they've done it well, and they deserve it. But that's not everyone's going to achieve that, so just, there's always going to be someone around you that's wealthier, that has a better car and a nicer house. Just be happy with what you've got. Don't constantly try to strive to be better than those other people. And just at some point, just be like, I'm happy with this. I'm done well enough now. So just when you're starting it, think about the reason you're starting it, and think about if you're starting a business in a saturated market, why are people going to buy from you? What's your USP? You know, what's your value proposition that others don't have?
Nice. Gem Energy has done some cool projects. You've done Australia Zoo, Convention Centre, among many others. Is there a particular project or a couple of projects that you are like, yeah, that's cool that we got to do that?
Yeah, right now we're working on a Navy base where they're making the nuclear submarines.
Cool.
And I'm like, you know, to win a contract with the Navy, you know, it's like where they're making the nuclear subs. That's pretty cool. Like, how did I get there?
You ask for a tour, please.
Like, Australia Zoo was, for me, the coolest project that we've ever done. And the reason for that is that I grew up, you know, in Cornwall in England, and one of my favorite shows was watching Steve Irwin. Crikey, I used to love it. And, you know, I really loved it. And I came to Australia, and a friend introduced me to the opportunity, and I was like, oh my God, we're going to get to price on that. And I was aggressive in price, but not too aggressive because I didn't want to devalue the brand. But when I got to present, I pushed to have an in-person presentation to the executives at the zoo. And I told them, I said, I was the biggest fan. I said, this would mean so much to me. I said, so, you know, I'm going to put everything into making sure this. And I was humble. I was, you know, like I was the CEO at the time, but I was still been like telling them how personally it would make me feel, you know, how much it meant to me. And, you know, that's humbling. And I think anybody will believe that when they can see that and they want to support you and they're like, do you know what? Let's do it. Versus a corporate being like, yeah, we'll do it. It means nothing to us.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
You know, I still think back to that and I think, how have I come from, you know, where I was as a kid to have done that project? Like, how did that happen? Like, you know, luck, you know, people say luck's not real. Luck
Make your own luck.
Yeah. Well, you do in some respects, but just so many decisions that have led to that happening, fate, whether you believe in that or not, but I don't. But I love that project. That's awesome. And the first big Tesla battery we did. So we did the first Tesla Power Pack, which is their commercial battery in Australia, and the first Tesla Power Pack installed on a school anywhere in the world. And that's still today on the Tesla global website as a case study. So yeah, that's cool. So we've done we probably have one of the most enviable portfolios of commercial projects in the country.
Yeah, nice. So we're into our top 3 moments, the final 3 questions that I ask everybody. So the first one, we kind of just answered it. The first one's like, what's been the highlight of your career so far? Is there anything besides those that have stood out to you that has been a highlight?
I've never been asked that question. Mate, that's a really tough one to answer. I think about highlights. If you'd asked me probably a couple of years ago, when I was a bit younger, it'd probably be the first time I bought my first Lamborghini.
Standard.
Standard. You know, I was a kid. I had a big picture of a bright yellow Lamborghini up on the wall, and I went and bought a bright yellow Lamborghini. That was a highlight. That would have been then, and not so much now. I think, you know, we've had a couple of really rough years in the business post the sort of transaction and with the, you know, what's happening in the economy and stuff. And I've, you know, since sort of being really back in charge and running things the way that I've wanted to run things, I've turned the business around and we're performing very, very well. That to me has been a highlight because, you know, things were really bad and I was just like, no, I want to be back in control. I can do this. And, you know, when you say to everybody you're going to do something and you have to prove that you can do it and that you do it, and it's just like, I'm not a fraud, you know, because you always have that imposter syndrome. Always. You can't help it. And
even if you've already been doing it, you
just can't. But I don't have that anymore, you know. And that's, I think for me now, it's recognizing that I can sit down with CFO or CEO of a multi-billion-dollar business and understand everything they're saying, talk their same language. And I'm 20, 30 years younger than most of them. So I think that's good. And I think I'll come out of this business being very well equipped to do anything that I want to do in the future. And I think that's the highlight, is that. And I just, when I think about where I'll be in 20 to 30 years, I'll look back on this period of time so fondly. And it is, as you know, business can be, the highs are so high, but the lows are so low. Yeah. But I'll look back on it and I'll remember the lows, but I also, when I am in a challenging time, I'm always thinking this too shall pass, and it always does. And you know what? It doesn't matter how hard it is. 3 months down the track, I can't even remember that low point, but I can remember the highs. And I think about the super yachts, the booking out of the resorts for parties. And I've been lucky to travel all over the world. I was going on 2 or 3 ski trips per year. I think about all the things that I've done. That's, I'm so grateful for that, and I'm grateful to be able to do that. So I think the lifestyle that it's enabled me to have is what I'm most grateful. That's the high. And it's, if I think about lows, post-transaction, that's always really difficult, losing something and seeing other people changing things. That's really,
because it's your baby.
Yeah, that's really difficult. And then ultimately, I think the next low will be the day that I leave. And walk away from the business and step down as the CEO. I will be very emotional in that point of time. But also, I'm starting to feel like that is the right time, and sometimes when So, yeah.
Yeah, nice. What's a piece of advice that's been given to you that's really stood out that you use constantly?
Well, I've never really had a mentor to give me any advice.
Maybe something that you've sort of told yourself.
Okay, if I was to say any advice for some things that I've told myself, is if if financially you're in a good place or you've started a good business, don't go spending all your money on material assets. I spent a silly amount of money on cars, houses, watches. It doesn't mean anything. Really, it is cool. Don't get me wrong. I love having Lambos. And
as he drove here in his Lamborghini.
I do. But you know what, Zane? In 3 years, I've done 3,000 kilometers in that car. Yeah. It's the first time I've driven it in about 3 months. It's just there's no point me owning it, But when you go in and you get to pay cash on a car like that, that's baller.
Big dick,
that is. That's cool. But if I could do it all again, the last thing that I would do is go buying material assets like that, especially for cash. I would invest everything into things that will generate me an annuity, because you don't create generational wealth owning $5 million worth of assets that generate you no cash flow. Toys. For the toys that are depreciating in value. Yeah, they're cool, and everyone's like, oh shit, yeah, he's got a Lambo, whatever, but it doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't carry any value. You look at it and it's once, but then after 3 months, the excitement's gone. You know what? This probably one of the lows. I got the first STO in the country, and I didn't even get excited about it. It meant nothing to me. Honestly, my heart rate didn't even change, and that sucks. When you get so immune, and that's because typically you're so emotionally closed off because stresses that come from running a business. But if I was to do it all again, I would have invested in order to create generational wealth, because, let's say you've got $5 million worth of assets debt free. If that 5 million was invested at a 7 to 8% yield, at 8%, you'd be getting $400,000 a year in annuity. Use your 400 grand to go and finance those things, and you still come out 100 to 200 grand in front.
Yeah, you still get your toys.
Yeah, you still get your toys, but you just invest. Now, what you've got then is 5 million firmly secured and invested, and you've got 400 grand forever. Now, if you was to withdraw 200 grand to live on, and you added that extra 200 grand back onto the 5 mil each year, well, then you get compounded interest and compounded returns. Now, you do that for, even if it's $1 million, you do that for 10 years, you're $1 million, you get 100 grand, you put all that 100 back in or 50 back in, then by the time you get to year 10, that one is worth 2.5 with compounded growth. So you always, for your whole life, have annuity. So even if you've got, if you've inherited a house and you've sold that house from your parents and you've got some good equity, don't spend it. invest it. Because in 10 or 15 years, and 10 or 15 years moves quick, yes, your friends could own or could have owned a Lamborghini or two, but that's not creating generational wealth. You know, you can then use that annuity that you've got in 10 or 15 years to buy Lambos every 3 years for the rest of your life. Yeah, you might not look as flash now, but you know what? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. It's about where you're going to be in the long term, because all of the happiness that you feel buying those assets, it fades. But, you know, to that day where you're 40 years old, and I'm looking forward to that, where I've got a few years yet. When I wake up and I don't have a job, and I've had a solid 8 hours sleep, and I open the window and it's sunny, the birds are chirping, and I know that I've got cash coming in and I don't have to work. The feeling that gives you is so much better than looking at your G-Wagon.
Yeah. I mean, you can go hire the Lambo for the day once a month.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, like, if you do want to buy things like G-Wagons, so finance it, you know, and finance it, put a big balloon on it. Like, I think when I bought mine, this is before they surged in price, I did actually finance that one at the time because it made so much sense to. You know, everybody sees people driving around in G-Wagons and Lambos, like, how do they afford it? Nobody pays cash for them. Not really. I was pretty stupid in doing that, really. But you go to G-Wagon, it was 300 grand. You put a 50% balloon on it and you finance it over 5 years. So you're only paying off the 150 plus the interest on the whole amount. It's like $1,600 a month in repayments. So if you financially engineer things, you can still have those nice things while still growing your wealth at the same time.
Yeah, $1,600 a month is
people
20K
can afford
a year,
that, mate.
20K a year out of your 400.
Yeah, but it's just exactly what I'm saying. So yeah, but you've got to get that set up first before you buy. A lot of people now, and I think social media drives this, but a lot of people want the fancy things now. And there'll be people driving around in Lambos and G-Wagons that don't even own their own house, you know, because it's what they want you to see.
Yeah. What is in the future for Mr. Hooper? What's the next big project or anything you'd love to work on? Or
mate, I'm really looking forward to hustling hard. I'm saying to you earlier, this is the hardest I've had to work in a long time, and you know, the effort that you have to put in at the moment with the economy the way that it is to generate a return, it's so much harder than it was to make money, you know. But I'm looking forward to hustling really hard over the next couple of years. And then my next big thing that I'm looking forward to is the wedding. So me and Lily recently got engaged, and I never thought I'd ever get married. I thought I'd be a single lad forever. Yeah.
In his Lamborghini.
Yeah, but I really couldn't be happier, and I don't know how I got so lucky with her. So my wedding in September 2026 is what I'm most looking forward to, and I'm hoping, all things going well, I'm hoping to take a year off. And me and Lily were going to spend a year in Lake Como.
Oh no, what a nightmare.
Yeah, tough gig. But I sort of need that, mate, just to reconnect with, you know, and I'm not a spiritual person, but you know, when you're so busy and stressed all the time, you never really take everything in, you know, so I'm just looking forward to taking foot off the gas. You know, I've got some other investments happening, and I know, like, I take a week off recently just because I needed a break. And by day 2, I was itching to do something. I can't. So I know that I'll get into something else, but don't yet know what that'll be. Maybe, I think I really like the idea of investing into businesses. Like, I know how to grow a business. I know how to sell stuff. I know how to pitch a product. I love the idea of going into someone's business and saying, look, you can pay me as a consultant. I've got the track record. I started a business from nothing. I exited, made money. I can help you on that journey. You can pay me to do that, or give me a percentage of the equity in the company. Yeah. Give me 5% or 10% of the equity, because ultimately that doesn't cost you anything. But then if I can double your EBIT, I'm only taking 10% and you're getting all that upside.
You're getting 90% for free.
Yeah, so it's quite, it's a unique way of thinking, but I quite like the idea of that as well.
Yeah, there's a big thing at the moment. Like, one of my friends, he was on the other day, you wouldn't do this, but they bought a small florist from a boomer who was ready to retire, 60 odd. They didn't do social. There's so many things they weren't doing because they're older. And so they just come in and add all the things that they know. And then Like, that's the thing. Like, you can go and buy businesses that are owned by older people that.
I love the idea of that, actually. Mate.
Yeah.
That
Find
sounds,
something that actually interests you, obviously.
yeah, and something like that, you know, for me, I'm not going to run it, but
No,
you know,
you still have a manager and leave all that stuff.
Yeah, see, that's where, I'd sort of look at appointing a manager and just overseeing and governing the business, really. But I think, and Lily will start her own thing at some point, so I'll be very keen on supporting her with whatever she chooses.
Maybe she can become the breadwinner, and you can.
Like, she sort of almost is in some respects. She's been sort of posting on social media and TikTok a lot, and I'm not a TikToker, you know. I'm not that sort of bloke. But she's just been doing it because she enjoys doing it. She's quite creative, and she's recently started taking off. Her page has got over 1 million likes now, and she's, you know, I can't even remember the last time that I paid for a date night. So you know, Lily always takes me out for date nights, and you know, so I think the next chapter for me will be, marriage, maybe family, and then encouraging her to go and do her thing, and then supporting her.
Yeah, sick. So 2 bonus questions, because one, I know you're a man of consuming content. Is there a book or a podcast that you've consumed lately that you'd recommend?
Not really. No, I think I don't listen to too many podcasts these days, and it's normally because people have them on in the background. I can't do that.
Nah.
And no, I can't have it on in the background. And if it is, I'm just like, oh, did I listen to that already?
Yeah,
you know, but in terms of books, there is one book for me that stands out above all other books, and it's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Classic. Dale
Carnegie. And I tell you, mate, that book, that book changed my life, and it changed my life in one pivotal meeting. I flew down to Melbourne, picked up my second or third Range Rover, drove it back, and I listened to it twice on the way back. And I listened to it because I was going into a meeting on the Monday, and it was a big meeting, and we'd done, you know, $15 to $20 million worth of projects for this one client, and we had a good relationship with the client, so they weren't tendering. And we were charging fair standard margins and things like that. But we'd built the business case very uniquely. I'd found some not loopholes, but I'd found some really clever ways of value engineering the solar and battery system. So these guys were installing batteries back in 2016, like before they were even a thing. And it's because I found the value prop to make them work. And after about 2 or 3 years of this rolling these batteries out, we got to one of the projects and it was like 3.5 million. So they were like, oh, we should probably get a second set of eyes over this. And it was just running on blind trust before then. And the second set of eyes came in and said, you can't do any of the things that he's told you can do. So everyone was panicking, you know, and I was like, oh, and I knew I was right. And I was going to go into that meeting swinging because I knew I was right. And I listened to this, and I actually changed my pitch and my approach to that meeting so much off of the back of that book that I had everybody on side within the first minute. And I went into that meeting and I was going to go in swinging because I knew I was right. And I knew I was right because the consultant that they'd engaged didn't understand how I'd value engineered things. So I'd found this, like, it's complicated, so I'm not going to go into the details, doing network tariffs and electricity retail agreements and stuff.
You'll lose me.
Yeah. So, but I went into that meeting and I recognized, well, let me think about how the customer feels. Let me think about how the consultant feels, and let me think about the documents that the consultant has seen. You know, and they'd only seen a 3-page summary investment, right, saying you're going to spend 3.5 million and get a 7.5 year payback. They did no data behind it. So I was like, okay, well, me going in swinging and telling them that they're wrong and I'm right isn't going to give them the outcome because they don't have the evidence to know why I'm so firm. So I printed all the emails and to show that I was right. And I went into the meeting and it was tense, right? The client had spent 15 million without knowing if it was going to do what it was going to do. And I was just like, the easiest way so I started the meeting and I was chairing it, and I said, look, I just want to start the meeting by apologizing to everybody in the room. I understand that there'll be some tension. That's natural. And the reason for that tension is because you haven't been given the opportunity to understand everything about the business case to have an informed opinion. So I understand why you feel the way that you do. I want to apologize. I could have and potentially should have given you more information, but this is like the 40th project that we've done for them, and we'd condensed it down into this 3-pager because they didn't need all the other guff anymore. So I said, but before we get into the meeting, I just want everybody to read these 2 documents, and I put the documents in front of everybody and said, and then after that, I'm happy to take on any questions. And they read the documents, and the consultant, first thing he said was, well, okay, well, this changes everything.
Yeah.
Meeting lasted about 10 minutes and we were all over in the cafe having a coffee afterwards.
It's just misinformation.
Yeah. And well, no, that was, it's not just misinformation. It's just understanding, well, what have they seen? Where is their viewpoint coming from? And if you understand why somebody feels the way they do, then you can solve for the issue. So just doing it that way, and like versus me going in swinging, right? Nobody's going to win. It's just going to be an argument. It's going to elevate tensions. Whereas me going in and being submissive in nature, it brings everybody's guard down. You apologize, and then you that instantly eroded any tension. They read the documents, and because the tension was gone and I'd been submissive, but they knew I was right, then they're like, well, he's being humble. He knows he's right. I'm happy to sign off on this now. And that was it. And that book on its own is what allowed me to change my mindset.
Yeah, perfect. Last one, just for fun. What's your dream car? No budget. Have you thought about it lately?
I love my STO. Yeah. I do love it. Do you know what though? And it's not even do you know what I'd really love? I would really love a 1963, 1966, something around that period, Mercedes convertible, the old school convertibles, but with full modern technology, full aircon, ventilated seats, power. So you have the reliability, and that's one of my next sort of possible ventures is actually to do resto mods, is to bring cars in like that and either do EV conversions on them or just fully restore them so that have the power windows, the remote locking. So it feels like, because for any of us that have owned those classics, like I had an old Ferrari 328 GTS, and I'd walk away from it and I would look over my shoulder and be like, oh yeah, that's sexy.
Yeah. But you get in it, it's
sack of shit to drive, mate.
Rolling down the window.
Yeah, but if I could jump into that car and have that drive like a modern car, it would be my daily. So probably something like that. Or you know what? I love the Ferrari 812 GTSs. Naturally aspirated V12. Oh, the sound of it, yeah. Maybe that's what I'll get next. Yeah. Or maybe an Aston Martin. Oh, there's too many to choose from, mate.
Depends what mood you're in.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your journey and your story and your many chunks of wisdom. I very much appreciate it. And I wish you all the best moving forward.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cheers.